Whether at home or work, life is about relationships. Welcome to Small Change, Big Dividends with your host, Branch Isole. Small Change, Big Dividends shares steps, tools, and tips for personal career and spiritual growth. So please welcome the host of Small Change, Big Dividends, Branch Isole.
Coming to you from deep in the forest, near the banks of the Ouachita River. You're watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends on the Bold Brave Media TV and Talk Global Network. I'm your host, Branch Isole, and today I'm pleased to be able to share the microphone with a featured guest, Mr. Chet Galaska. Small Changes, Big Dividend is a show where your questions are part of the program. And today's episode is a special importance if you have questions about diabetes or a Christian walk, because Mr. Galaska will discuss and answer any questions that you might have around the disease diabetes. So if you've got a question, you can use our toll-free number, 1-866-451-1451. Thanks for joining us today. On Small Changes, Big Dividends, we talk about personal, career, and spiritual Christianity essentials for growth-filled living. Each week, I share mana'o with listeners from around the world. Today, Chet and I are going to share some small changes that can pay big dividends in your relationships and in your life. Because life is about relationships, but it's healthy relationships that encourage and embrace growth. Today is a fifth Wednesday on Small Changes, Big Dividends. If you're unfamiliar with our fifth Wednesday show episodes, every month that has a fifth Wednesday, we invite a guest expert to share information and takeaways in areas of life that affect many in our audience. Our guests share unique and poignant information for enhanced daily living. Our previous guests shared how to prepare for, react in, and respond to school shooting scenarios. And if you missed it, that was episode 22. However, our guest today is Mr. Chet Galaska. Chet is a retired company president who works to dispel myths and misconceptions surrounding diabetes. He's not a medical professional, but Chet has lived with diabetes since 1981 and relates as an expert from the perspective of those who live with the disease. Chet says that general ignorance about diabetes is the real problem that often deters or postpones care. Chet's goal is to create a more informed society that respects those who fight the disease while encouraging the rest of us to learn more. Chet has written books, spoken to groups, and created the Challenge Diabetes program. He also developed a diabetes education program presented in participation with the YMCA, the University of Massachusetts, Springfield College, as well as civic organizations, churches, and the Men of Color Health Awareness Program. Chet was presented the Heroes Walking Among Us Award by the Massachusetts Foot and Ankle Society. Welcome, Chet. It's a pleasure to have you as our fifth Wednesday guest today. Is there anything I missed or you'd like to add?
No, that just about covers the waterfront branch as far as diabetes goes. Uh, you might have mentioned I've been married to my wife for 48 years now. We've got 2 sons, 2 wonderful daughters-in-law, and 3 grandchildren. So that kind of rounds out my resume.
Yeah,
That's what I'm all
good.
about.
Yeah, great. It's always nice to have the family involved, and of course, grandchildren make it all worthwhile.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
So you said something in the introduction that you sent about how people don't know about diabetes. You know, I've heard of diabetes and I've known the term since I was a teenager, but if you asked me to explain it, I couldn't. And so I know there's a lot of general questions among the population for those who don't have the disease. And so let's start there. You mentioned that, the awareness is the real key.
Yeah, at this point, we know how to treat diabetes. I've been pretty diligent about taking care of mine for the last 40 some odd years, and I'm doing fine. The problem is that many people don't take care of it at all. And these people are, they're having the same result as people did 1,000 years ago. They die from it because diabetes is a fatal disease if you don't take care of it. One of the reasons that people don't take care of it is that there are misperceptions about the disease that blame diabetics for having the disease in the first place. The most common idea is that if you're overweight, you're going to get it. If you eat too much sugar, you're going to get it. If you're sedentary, that leads to it as well. The problem is that all of those things are based on personal behavior. So there's a blame and shame that gets added into the equation. The problem with that is that a lot of people don't want to admit they have diabetes because they don't want to put up with the grief about it. I used to give programs in person before COVID, and I actually had a woman break down in tears because of the grief her father gave her about being overweight. He told her if you lost the weight, you wouldn't have diabetes, which is completely untrue. Well, this brings up the main misconception. Diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, starts when a genetic predisposition encounters something in the environment that triggers it. We know from a recent study that there are at least 117 genes that may cause type 2 diabetes. We know that there are lots of triggers, but we really can't nail them down. And it may be that there are different triggers for different people. So these are not things that are in personal control. If you have the genes and you hit the trigger, you're going to wind up with the underlying causes of diabetes, and that's beyond your control. So one of the first things I try to do is dispel that. When I was doing the courses, the most gratifying thing for me was when somebody would come up to me afterwards and tell me that the most valuable thing I told them was that they weren't at fault for getting it. You could just see the guilt and shame drip off their faces because they've been living for the past 15 or 20 years believing that they caused the disease. They didn't really know how or why, but that's what everybody thought, and that's what they thought too. So the number one thing we need to dispel is this idea that people bring diabetes on themselves. If you look at the raw statistics, the National Institutes of Health says that 70% of us are overweight, but only about 10% of us have diabetes. Well, that means that 6 out of 7 overweight people never become diabetic. At the same time, many thin people do become diabetic. The reason for that is because it's genetic and it's got to hit an environmental trigger. So by doing that, if we can get people in the general public to understand what's going on, we can encourage diabetics to fight the disease. Importantly, the more people understand about what causes it and how it's treated, the more support they can give to the friends and relatives that have the disease and help them along the path of controlling their blood sugars.
Got it. So is blood sugar the main culprit here with the hereditary?
It is. When you get, well, let me explain how diabetes works first. Everything I'll say will make more sense if I do that. In normal bodies, when your body digests food, it gets turned into glucose, which is a simple sugar. It gets into your bloodstream and it goes to every cell in your body. The cells use it for energy. When your pancreas senses the glucose in the blood, it releases a hormone called insulin. Insulin's job is to act as a key that opens up the cell walls to allow the glucose to enter. In normal people, there's a balance. When you eat, your blood sugar rises, then the insulin goes in and it drops. When the glucose enters the cells, it does two things. One is it gives the cells the energy they need, but the other is that it leaves the bloodstream. So there's this fine dance that happens all the time where it keeps your blood sugar in a fairly narrow range. Now, with diabetics, this process doesn't work anymore. With type 1 diabetics, which is what I have, we have an autoimmune disease, which has triggered our immune system to kill the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. So my pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin to take care of the problem at all. So for type 1s, the course of action is pretty clear. You have to take insulin, and that has to be taken by subcutaneous injection because it breaks down in digestion. So that type accounts for 5 to 10% of all cases. But the other 90 to 95% are type 2. And that's mainly what I talk about because it is the prevalent form of diabetes. It's a different disease that also causes high blood sugars. Type 2s get a condition called insulin resistance, and it is exactly what its name suggests. It makes your cells resistant to insulin, which means that your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to get the cell walls to open to let the glucose enter. It naturally gets worse over time, so your pancreas loses its ability to produce insulin. By the time you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, you've probably lost about half of the pancreas's ability to produce insulin. That's when the diabetes gets diagnosed because, number one, your body can't produce enough insulin, and at the same time, your body cells are demanding more and more of it. So that's where the problem is there. The term diabetes, by the way, it's kind of a catch-all term. It just means high blood sugar. Type 1 refers to one way that it gets high. Type 2 is a different way. They're really two different diseases that happen to cause high blood sugar.
Interesting. I didn't know that to begin with. So I always hear A1C as the
Yes.
marker, and can you explain that and tell me what my doctor says you need to get it under 7, and we keep going down, and so what does all this mean?
Sure. The damage from diabetes doesn't happen because of momentary high blood sugars. It happens because of chronically average high blood sugars. The A1C measures your average blood sugar for the previous 3 months. So that really is a gold standard. If you went to the doctor, depending on whether you just ate lunch or not, your blood sugar might be high, it might be low. There are a lot of variables that can impact the particular single blood sugar. But with the A1C, it is the gold standard because it shows what the average is. Now, an average blood sugar for a person without diabetes is 5.7 or under. Once it gets over 5.7, you're diagnosed with prediabetes. And if it gets much higher than that, then you reach a threshold where diabetes is diagnosed. One of the misconceptions a lot of people have is that prediabetes and diabetes are different diseases. Actually, they're not. They're both produced by insulin resistance, which is incurable, and they're both managed the same way by using diet, exercise, and medications. What they really are milestones along the way. They're just benchmarks that say, well, your sugar's higher than it should be, or it's really a lot higher than it should be. So that's the difference there.
Okay, so we're shooting for 5.7 or lower. Is there a way that I can do that what can I do in my daily life to ensure that I'm trying to get to that goal or keep it down low?
Well, let me first tell you that if you've got insulin resistance, you're probably not going to get it down to 5.7. That's really hard to do. You would really have to, control your diet and exercise and medication with an iron fist. And most people don't have the knowledge or the willpower to do that. A realistic goal is 7.0 or under, which is what diabetics are asked to shoot for. That's more realistic. And in fact, mine goes 6.8, 6.9. So, I can do it. I've been doing it for a long time, and other people can do it as well. The way you do that, as I mentioned, is through diet, exercise, and medication. Some people do it with just diet and exercise. The reason for that is that the easiest way to keep your blood sugars down is to not raise them in the first place. So you can avoid raising them in the first place by avoiding the foods that will raise them. Now, we know that sugar will raise it for sure. But the thing a lot of people don't understand is that carbohydrates in general will raise them. There's another form of carbohydrate that's called starch. Starches they're not sweet, but when they're digested, they turn into glucose. In fact, 1 gram of carbohydrate digests into 1 gram of sugar. So don't let the fact that bread isn't quite as sweet as sugar fool you. When it gets digested, it's the same thing. So instead of looking at the nutrition label and picking out the total sugars added and that sort of thing, don't do that. You go to the total carbohydrate because that figure includes both carbohydrates and sugar. Sugar, by the way, is a form of carbohydrate. It's just that it's the obvious one.
Sure. We're going to take a quick break for our first commercial. And when we come back, I want to ask you, is there any difference between a vegetarian diet and, a more traditional protein rich meat kind of diet? So my guest today is Chet Galaska. He's an expert about diabetes and all the things we want to ask him about diabetes. You're watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends on the Bold Brave Media TV and Talk Global Network. I'm your host, Branch Isole. Chet and I will be right back.
What if there were a super tiny device that could diagnose the brain and is smaller than a single human hair? What if you could see inside the brain to help an epilepsy patient during surgery or to help the fight against Parkinson's disease? Dr. Patricia Broderick is proud to announce the Broderick Probe, a biomedical and electronic breakthrough. Imagine a probe to help with the understanding and potential cure of brain-related diseases. To learn more, listen live to the Easy Sense radio show with host Dr. Broderick, Wednesdays 7 p.m. Eastern on the Bold Brave Media Network and TuneIn Radio. And to help support the Broderick Foundation, please go to EasySense.com and learn how, with your help, we can fight these horrific brain disorders. That's EasySense.com to learn more and help support the Broderick Foundation. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness, Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals. Listen to John Hawkins' My Strategy, Saturdays, 1 p.m. Eastern on the BBN Global Network and TuneIn Radio.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends. I'm your host, Branch Isole, and my special guest today is Mr. Chet Galaska. Chet, I wondered about this vegetarian diet as opposed to, a more standard, traditional, what do they used to call that pyramid, the 8 levels that they promoted so much when you and I were kids, with
Right.
a lot of bread and a lot of sugar. So by being a vegetarian, does that help me in any way control that intake, especially of carbs? If I'm cutting back on the meat and the protein factors, do I have to watch the carbs even more?
Well, you've really touched on a key thing here. One of the things you need to do as a diabetic is to understand where the carbs are. What I tell people is that you don't have to worry about every food in the world. Worry about the stuff that you're actually eating, because that's what's going to control your blood sugar. If you look at your breakfasts, they're pretty much the same. Lunches are probably pretty much the same. Dinners will vary more, but they'll repeat over the course of a month. What you want to do is look at those foods and figure out which ones are high carb, and those are the ones you need to moderate. Now, if you're a vegetarian, the chances are you're on a relatively low carb diet because vegetables tend to be lower in carbohydrate. Not all of them are, though. Peas, for example, are very high in carbohydrate. If you want to classify corn as a vegetable, that's also high in carbohydrate. But you can take a look at the individual foods you're eating and figure out pretty easily, how high they are. You can Google them on the web, or you can ask, what's her name? Ask Mike. Why can't I come to ask the machine that's always talking to me in my
Uh,
dining room?
Alexa.
Alexa, ask Alexa, and she'll tell you. So there are lots of ways to find this out. Now, you mentioned protein. Protein actually doesn't raise your blood sugar at all. And that's one of the key things about diabetes. You should be eating more protein and less of the high carb foods. Proteins are not just meats, but fish, eggs, poultry. That's stuff that you can fill up on. And it's good in two ways. One is that it doesn't raise your blood sugar, but the other is that it takes longer to digest, so you feel full for longer. If you eat high carb foods, they digest very quickly, and half an hour you're hungry again. So that's in a nutshell. That's how you go about trying to control your food intake.
So
Nutritionists are really, yeah. Go ahead.
I'm gonna stay away from starch and sugar, basically.
Yeah. Now you can still eat it, Branch. You're not consigned to never ever eating a bowl of pasta again. I eat my favorite foods, which tend to be high carb, but I do it sparingly. If I have a plate of spaghetti, I'll enjoy it while I'm doing it, but I won't be eating it every day. Matter of fact, here's a good example for you. In one of the classes, I had a woman who told me she couldn't keep her blood sugars below 200. Normal is 70 to 130, so 200 is pretty high. It turned out that her husband worked the second shift, and he liked to have dinner when he came home, and he liked pasta. And she liked to eat with him, so she would eat the pasta as well. So I asked her for the next week, just eat something that's low carb instead of the pasta. She came back a week later, and then her blood sugar was down around 100. So for her, the low-hanging fruit was the pasta. And as soon as she identified that and cut it down, well, then her blood sugars were fine. So sometimes it can be as simple as that.
Great idea. So tell me about these new advertisements I see where you no longer have to prick your finger to get your blood. Um, I'm amazed that they work. Uh, do they work as well as they're promoted? And what in the world is going on?
It's technology. It's amazing stuff. When I first became diabetic in 1981, the only way you knew what your blood sugar was to have a material called test tape. It was a yellow paper that came in a dispenser that looked like a tape measure. You would unreel a few inches of it, and then you would dip it in a urine sample. If it stayed yellow, it means that your blood sugar was okay. If it turned various shades of green, it looked like there was more and more sugar in your urine. So if it turned black, it meant your sugar was really high. The problem was that was old news because it was produced an hour earlier. So you really didn't know what your blood sugar was at all. A few years after that, they developed glucose meters that you could use personally at home. And that's when you had to prick your finger and take a blood sample. And it would tell you right then and there what your blood sugar was at that moment. And that was just an amazing step forward. I mean, all of a sudden we had real information that we could deal with right away. Well, fast forward to today, and you've got something called the continuous glucose monitor. I use one. It's something you apply in your skin, under the fat tissue, and it stays there for 10 days. It radios your blood sugar to a monitor that I keep in my pocket. I can pull it out right now, press a button, and it'll tell me what my blood sugar is. And I can do this anytime I want to. There's no finger stick required at all because it's always in there. So the technology is just amazing. That's why I mentioned earlier when we first started that we know how to treat diabetes. We do. It's hard, but we know what to do. The problem is motivating people to do it.
Yeah, motivation, always the key factor, right?
Well,
Choice.
well, it is, especially with a disease that really requires your attention every day, all day. The first thing I think about during the day is what's my blood sugar? And I ask myself that periodically throughout the day because I've got to do different things depending on what my blood sugar is. So, it takes knowledge and it does take some fortitude, but you can certainly do it.
So with these new devices, then, do you do it before and after you eat generally, or does it help you decide at a meal, what you may want to eat or what you may want to choose from what's on the table?
Yeah. Well, what I do, ideally, you should do it like 20 minutes before your meal.
Okay.
With the system I've got, it knows my blood sugar, and I have to put in an estimate of how many carbohydrates I'm going to be eating. So I punch that number in, and the computer automatically computes how much insulin I'm going to need to cover that amount of carbohydrate. So there again, it's pretty remarkable. But in practicality, I don't do that 20 minutes ahead of time because I'm never really sure what I'm actually going to be eating. I look at my plate and I ask myself, where are the carbs? And I can identify them. I know bread, I know potato, I know that the meats aren't going to raise it, and, you know, I calculate it in my head and I tell the computer I'm going to be eating 50 carbs and it takes it from there. I'll give you another example. I was at a Christmas dinner one time, and the guy sitting next to me knew that I had diabetes. It was in a Polish restaurant. So I ordered the Polish platter. It had sausage, galunkies, which are stuffed cabbage, pierogies, which are little dumplings, and a few other things. And the guy asked me, "Are you going to eat all that?" I said, "Well, let me tell you what I'm going to do." So the sausage, the kielbasa, that doesn't have any carbs at all. So I'm going to eat all that. They gave me 2 slices of bread. I'm going to eat a half a slice of bread. The stuffed cabbage, it's half pork and it's half rice. The cabbage won't raise it, pork won't raise it, but the rice will. So I'll include that. The pierogies I happen to really like, so I'm going to eat those, but I'm going to compensate for that as well. So I went through this whole litany of everything that was on the plate, and so I ate it. And the following day, he asked me what my blood sugar was that morning, and it was 114, which was perfect. So that's the kind of thing a diabetic has to do. You have to be aware of what you're doing. So
Again, discipline, right? Discipline,
well,
motivation, knowing what you're eating and what it potentially might do to your body.
knowing that is the number one thing. My favorite quote about diabetes was by Dr. Elliot Joslin. The diabetes clinic at Harvard University is named after him. What he said is the diabetic who knows the most lives the longest. He's right about that. And I keep learning more about this disease, even though I've had it for as long as I have. You really need to know what the food is, know how your body's going to react. For example, you have to understand how exercise helps. Exercise for a diabetic doesn't mean going out and sweating and running a marathon. It means you're doing everyday activity. What we find, or what's been found, is that just staying in motion, playing with the kids, vacuuming, climbing the stairs, walking a longer distance from your car to the office, those kind of everyday mundane activities really are effective in controlling your blood sugar. The reason for that is that your muscle tissue, if it's active, uses the glucose. It takes it right out of your bloodstream and it uses it. And if it's sedentary, it absorbs it anyway. It takes it out of the blood and it saves it for future use. So having muscle mass and being moderately active is a powerful way to control your blood sugars.
Perfect sense. Perfect sense.
It is perfect sense, but you know what? You have to know it. You have to know this is what's going on. And many, many people don't.
That's why being a lifelong student is so important for all of us.
Absolutely.
We're gonna take our second break. Caleb's ready to take us out. You're watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends on the Bold Brave Media TV and Talk Global Network. I'm your host, Branch Isole. Chet and I'll be right back.
Did you know that your beliefs create your entire reality, but it's the subconscious beliefs that do most of the creating? Belief shifter and life coach Shiraz can help you identify those limiting beliefs and eliminate them, often in a single session.
Like it was almost instant, like I had relief right away.
Creating better health, relationships, careers, and finances. Let Shiraz help you step out of safety and into awareness.
Definitely something's happening. It's like a flow inside. It feels good.
Whether in person or online, Shiraz provides personal coaching, belief shifting. Visit Shiraz at energeticmagic.com or call 416-529-7429. Energetic Magic on the BBM Global Network, Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. Find your greater happiness. Be well. Be aware. Be magical.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends. I'm your host, Branch Isole, and with me today is my special guest, Mr. Chet Galaska. We're talking about diabetes. I wanted to give Chet a couple of minutes he's got a couple of books here on diabetes. One is called The Diabetes Book, What Everyone Should Know. And the second is Living on a Tightrope, Coping with Diabetes. So, Chet, give us a little information about your books and how people can get more information from you.
Sure. The main book is the first one you mentioned, the diabetes book, What Everyone Should Know. That book was written not just for diabetics, but for people who care about them and everybody else who wants to know the facts. Diabetes is a very complex subject, and it's hard to really get a handle on it. But I do have a way of making things simple and understandable, and that's what I've done with the key things about diabetes. More importantly, I've developed a couple of short videos about diabetes that can explain this quickly and simply to diabetics, those who care about them, and the general public. My hope is that people in churches or other organizations will watch these in groups so that everybody can get a basic education about it, but also can have an interesting experience among themselves, because just about everybody has it, knows somebody who does or fears getting it, and they mostly have stories about diabetes that they share. So it's really a powerful way to help everybody out. So my website is challengediabetes.us. And if you go there, you'll see what's there, along with a bunch of other shorter videos that I've produced. The other book I wrote is called Finding Faith in a Skeptical World. I wrote that because of my journey to Christianity. I was raised in the Methodist Church right through high school, but then I went to college, went to a philosophy course, and lost my faith in a heartbeat. It's an unfortunate thing that happens to lots of people. But in the years after, I really read up a lot about it. And the things I read really confirmed my atheism. So I thought I was pretty well educated about it, and I knew what I thought. And I just thought Christianity was a nice thing to believe in, but there really wasn't much to it. Well, my wife and I had children. My oldest was turning 4. And even though I didn't believe in God, I knew that church had been a valuable part of my upbringing, and I wanted to expose my kids to it. I wasn't going to tell them what I thought until they were 20 years old and could really talk about it as adults. So I got thinking to myself that it would really be nice if I believed this stuff because, I'd like to sleep on Sunday mornings. I started thinking this way, and things started coming up in odd places, like on radio programs or magazines. Back in the day, we had magazines. Uh, Conversations that I would have that were answering questions that I had, and the answers were coming down on the side of faith, and they weren't coming down on the side of atheism. So this went on for a few months until I had a guy that I respected a lot come in to see me on business. So we got done conversing about the business things, and I asked him what he thought about faith. Well, since I asked, he was happy to tell me because he was a serious Christian. And the things he told me just really caught me, unawares and unprepared. And he really slapped me upside the head like, how foolish must I be to not see this? So that really got me curious. And I started reading about more things that were on the pro-Christian side. So I'm on the fence. And one night I was walking into my son's room. Every night for months, we'd read the same book. It was about PJ Funny Bunny. It was called It's Not Easy Being a Bunny. And I didn't even need the book anymore. I had the thing memorized. So there was a Child's Book of Prayers, which is a golden book. It was on his bookshelf with about 40 other golden books. And we had never read that. I thought it was kind of a joke that it was even up there in the first place. Well, I was walking into his room, and in my own head, I just said, I'll tell you what, God, if John wants to read that Child's Book of Prayers tonight instead of PJ, then I'll believe. Well, John had PJ in his hands. He put it on his bed, walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out the Book of Prayers, and he said, I want to read this tonight. So, Branch, that happened over 40 years ago. And I'm getting a chill up my spine because that's what happens every time I tell that story. God is there. And he may not answer every prayer that you offer, but when he sees fit, he answers big time. So that is what really got me to believe. And for me, I guess I was a hard enough case that God said, this guy's going to need something a little extra special. So I'm going to do this for him. He didn't do it to me. He did it for me. Sure. Because every time I have intellectual doubts about faith, which we all do because nobody is smart enough to wrap their head around God. Every time I have any kind of doubt, I just go back to that and say, I have to believe. Well, after that, my physician was also a Christian, and he went to a Baptist church. So he did a Sunday school class, and he asked me to come see the class. Now, he and I hadn't talked about faith at all, but he offered the invitation anyway. So I went just to see how this guy fit into a Baptist environment. And I went to the class for 8 or 10 weeks, and everything he said really made sense. It made sense for living. And I finally ventured downstairs, and I started going to church. From then, I got invited to a Bible study, and my faith just grew and grew as I learned more and more. I realized that the world really spoke about faith being the real thing. And as I've gotten older in life and exposed myself to more and more, I see God all over the place. So that's been my journey. Jesus Christ is a big part of my life. I could never, ever have seen that happening, so many years ago, but he is real. And that's
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. The interesting thing, and I have a similar situation in my life. I embraced the world for 40 years in a really big way, right? And I hit rock bottom and I thought, well, there's got to be something else. And so I went on a 5-year journey searching for truth. And I decided that no matter what happened, I would try and come from the truth in every situation with every person that I interacted with. And it was a struggle. For anybody out there who's not on the Christian path, the world embraces us in all the ways that it possibly can, right? It doesn't want to lose us to the Lord. And so after this 5 years of looking for truth and studying and New Age and mysticism and other religions, what I discovered was at the core of every spiritual belief system or religion is a fundamental tenet that is love God first and most, treat your neighbor as yourself. And that's what brought me back to Christianity. I was raised in a Christian home, but I always say we were C, E, and O, Christmas, Easter, and occasionally. So I was like you, I knew what Christianity was, but I didn't know anything about it. And when I discovered the path back to truth, that truth brought me back to Christ. And so I, like you, started at ground zero, not knowing anything, but knowing that if I was going to go on this path, I had to know more.
Exactly.
What I discovered is now in my life, 40 years later, 40 years not on the path and 40 years on the path, what I've discovered is when you come into contact with another Christian, you automatically have a connection that you don't have if you're in the world and of the world, right?
Yep.
Because Christians, every Christian, and whether you're a brand new Christian or whether you're an old school Christian, it doesn't matter. The foundation that we have in Jesus Christ brings us into God's family again as children. And people often talk to me about God and, well, is he a loving God? Some Christians say he's all about love and other Christians say he's all about punishment. And I always say God is like a loving parent, right? He only wants what's best for us. But what most people don't realize about a Christian walk or a Christian relationship is, first of all, it has to be voluntary on our part. God never forces us, coerces us, connives us into believing in him and his son. So it has to be something, it's like the diabetes, we have to take the action to make it happen for our own health, whether it's our diabetes and our general health or whether it's our spiritual health.
Yep.
And so I always enjoy, talking with Christians because there's an automatic connection. And from that place, from that connection with the Lord, we can talk about any subject matter, but we have that connection. And you don't have that with someone who's not on the path, who's not, a believer in Christ. And when I deal with young couples, especially, probably the most detrimental thing to your success as a young couple is if one of you is a believer and the other one isn't. You can't have that connection if you don't both believe, because when we walk with Christ, we walk with Christ, and he's always with us. Once we ask him and invite him into our lives, he never abandons us. He's always there. And so it's very difficult for a Christian believer, either sex, to be in a relationship with a non-believer or somebody who is an atheist or just generally hatred of spirituality. And so this connection is so important between us as adults, between us and our children, and between us and our partners. And so the one thing I always love about interacting with Christians and having Christians on my program is, before we ever talk about the content or whatever the stories may be, I know that there's a foundational relationship there already built for us. And we understand that Christ plays an important part in our lives for a specific reason and for a specific purpose.
Yep. Earlier, Branch, you mentioned other religions, and you're right. They do basically have that fundamental thing in common. But one of the things that brought me to Christianity is looking at the creation stories for the various religions. If you look at the Genesis account, it mirrors what science believes to be true. The orders of creation exactly match what happens. The gaps between the steps of creation are there. And so it really does match up what we have figured out to be the way that the earth started. Other religions have other stories, turtles diving into the water and coming up with a handful of mud and, stuff like that. But it struck me that what's with this Judeo-Christian thing where Moses, thousands of years ago, came up with all these things. How could he possibly have known that? So that really struck me. And of course, as you read more about the Bible, you realize that the life lessons that are valid, that are there, it becomes very powerful. By the way, you mentioned about it being hard to be people who are on not on the same wavelength as far as Christianity goes. I was an atheist, but my wife was a non-practicing Roman Catholic, so she wasn't big into religion. I certainly wasn't. So when I started going to church, I I asked her to come along, and she came along too, and the two of us got baptized on the same day. So we're both very active in our church. Have been for a long time.
Yeah.
So
Baptism is it's interesting because people go, well, what's all this baptism thing? Well, baptism is simply an outward show of a new inward belief, right?
yep.
And people say, well, I was baptized as a child. Is that going to do it? Well, the answer is actually no. When you're baptized as an infant or a child, that's an invitation to join that fellowship group, that denomination, wherever you're getting fed the word. And so that's why we want to be baptized again as now knowledgeable adults, more knowledgeable about the world, more knowledgeable about how the world operates and the lessons of life. And now we have the capacity and the maturity to take on a new relationship outside of ourselves, a spiritual relationship. So if you're out there and you haven't been baptized as an adult, go ahead and do it. It will bring a light that you hadn't expected, and that's all I can say about it. But it's certainly worth being baptized as an adult, even if you were baptized into a community as a child. Um, it's just such a it's walking with the Lord. There's no way to explain it until you start to do it, right? And you mentioned earlier, the more we involve ourselves with the Lord and His Word, the more clear things become, more evidence we see of God's truth, not only in the Bible, not only in Scripture, not only in the words of Christ Himself, but once we have His Spirit within us, our eyes are open, the veil is lifted, and we start to recognize truth everywhere in our lives. And once you recognize truth and you start to walk that path of truth, I can tell you this, and I'll bet Chet can verify it. The stress and struggle of your life will start to fade away because you're no longer trying to decide between, well, what's right and wrong, or what's the reward and punishment for this, for me in this situation. Once we see the truth in our lives, and especially in our own lives, our family life, our community life, our neighborhood life, things start to become very, very clear. Then the choice for the Christian actually comes to its cross point. Knowing the truth, am I now going to respond truthfully, the way that God would have me respond, the way that Jesus did respond, and the way His Spirit will direct me to respond in this situation? Or am I just going to turn my back on what I'm now learning about the truth in my world and go back to the old me, go back to embracing the world, and go back to the stress and the struggle of daily living?
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. I read a book not too long ago. It was called "Believing is Seeing" instead of "Seeing is Believing." The guy who wrote it was a well-known scientist who had faith, lost his faith, then came back to faith. He came back to faith because of what he had learned doing his scientific studies. But I thought that that term, believing is seeing, that really says it all. Because once you believe and you put the things you see in the perspective of Christianity, then all of a sudden you see all kinds of things that reinforce it. If you don't believe, you don't notice them. But that's one of the things that keeps my faith growing because I see it all over the place. Believing is seeing.
Yeah, when God is active in your life, you see God work in your life in little ways, in big ways. But you start to recognize things that you hadn't thought about before and things that you had passed over before. One of the problems with so many people today is they don't want to believe. right? It's just like the education, self-education of diabetes and how to control it. You have to choose to make those steps. You have to
Yes.
choose to make those decisions. It's like you're the only one who cares more about your health than nobody else. The doctors today, they care, but it's not the way it used to be. When they didn't have as much information, as much technology, they took a little more time with trying to help you solve the issue instead of just, okay, well, we've got a medicine that can take care of that for you as long as you keep taking the medicine. So,
Right.
we're coming to the end. Chuck, is there anything else you can share with my audience?
Heard a lot of pretty good stuff, Branch. With the diabetes, if you have it or you have somebody you love who has it, please learn about it. Really, the best way to do it, the quickest and easiest way, is to go to my website and download one or two of the videos that I've produced there. I charge them just because they have expenses, but you can get them for $1.99. So I'm not going to break anybody. But please have a look at those. When it comes to faith, finding faith in a skeptical world addresses every issue that I had to come to terms with to go from being an unbeliever to being a believer. And if you have questions about faith, or you have somebody you'd like to introduce faith to, that might be a good way to do it because it's easily readable. It's not a terribly long book. But the one thing I wanted to leave you with is something that a Christian friend told me. She said that when she became a Christian, she found that she was never alone. She said, I may be by myself, but I'm never alone. And I thought, wow, that's pretty powerful. But you know what? That's how I feel too. No matter where I am, whether I'm by myself or not, Jesus is with me. God's with me.
Amen. Thank you, Chet. I really appreciate you coming on. A lot of valuable information, and I want to encourage everybody out there who's heard us today to find out more about diabetes. I'm going to guess that there's probably somebody in everyone's family or extended family that's got this disease or battling this disease. So find out more. Go to Chet's website, pick up those videos. That'll help you explain it and to learn more about it. You've been watching and listening to Small Changes, Big Dividends on the Bold Brave Media TV and Talk Global Network. I'm your host, Branch Isole. Until next week, be in the world, not of the world.
This has been Small Change, Big Dividends. When you're ready for healthier, more successful relationships at home or work, Small Change, Big Dividends is your show. Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern on the Bold Brave TV network.